Hey Knights, apparently I'm missing a few chapters for this whole thing, so I have to re-film these 3 chapters since it apparently never got put on. So this is for the Mermaids course 7 through 9, re-recording. So chapter 7, Bathing Incident. Amara didn't join the rest of the company for lunch that afternoon. For being a mermaid and having little to no perception of time, she squandered it away in the depths of the hot spring in which she bathed. The young elf, whose name she discovered to be Lindar, had shown her to her room, which overlooked the entire valley. The room itself was indeed magnificent, but she had no love for white walls, lavender drapes, and lukewarm marble. What she was drawn towards lay just outside her room, upon a small stone overlook, for there sat a round, open spring that bubbled up from within the rocks itself. White pillars stood delicately, and silver curtains floated around her as she watched over the valley, indulging in the hot, fresh waters and mild, fragrant air. She wasn't used to the water being warm, but goodness, could she get used to it? Everything here was so polar opposite as to how she'd spent her entire life. She'd very rarely even seen the sun, and now here she was, bathing in water she didn't even know could exist, and basking in the luxurious smells and sounds. Although not everything was necessarily to her taste. She indulged herself nonetheless. It was a staggering improvement to the oozy walls and the putrid smells of the caves. She had found herself a large bar of sweet-smelling soap and a silver hairbrush that had been laid on the vanity in her room, and was subsequently pampering herself. She brushed knot after knot out of her hair, leaving it for once silky smooth to the touch, and completely coated herself in the soap, scrubbing harshly at her golden scales to make them gleam. It was disgusting how dirty her tail had become. However, she quickly found out that the soap definitely didn't taste as good as it smelled. She ran the soap along her chest, just under her collarbone, feeling the hard bumps of the aqua crystals that lay there in a smooth pattern. Partly submerged in her skin, they positively gleamed in sunlight, having spent so many years hidden away under her blouse and constantly covered in slime and grime. She had just started humming to herself when she heard shouting and cheering a little ways along from her on the ground below. She looked around to find the source, peering over the edge of the spring. Although she saw nothing from where she basked, her sharp ears determined where the ratty noise was coming from. Carefully, and rather inelegantly, she clambered out of the water, flickering her foot violently to banish the stubbornly lingering fin which tripped her up. She pulled her white robe tightly around herself for decency and set off to chase the echoing sounds of the roughhousing. She slipped and slid across her outlook, hopping down a few stones that came off the side. She descended down a narrow, rather rocky path towards the noise for a few moments, before turning a corner that opened up onto another beautiful ledge, which this time overlooked the elven gardens. She was still staring at her feet in concentration when her voice called out for her. "Amara, over here!" Keely's voice rang out to her again, and she finally looked up. She almost wished she hadn't. There they were, the rest of the company, still a small way away from her, and down another set of steps that led into the garden. They, too, were enjoying a good wash, but in one of the large fountains, completely nude. Amara gasped and blushed as Keely quite openly waved at her from his position on both her shoulders. The young mermaid couldn't seem to find any words as she stared helplessly at the nude prince before her, eyes wide with bewilderment. Suddenly, Keely was pushed off a bomb for her shoulders by his brother, and they all cheered. Amara blinked at them all, not entirely sure where to put her gaze, but still too curious not to move. She'd never seen anyone naked before, and although she wasn't entirely sure what nudity was all about, she did know it made her feel incredibly awkward and wasn't usually something that people, or dwarves in this case, paraded around in, or not in. Although feeling her retinas burn slightly from the sight of Bomper nude, she couldn't help but keep her gaze traveling, mainly out of curiosity of the male anatomy. She knew she shouldn't, but none of the dwarves seemed to care or notice about her snooping gaze, until, that is, she landed on Thorin Oakenshield. His gaze was already on her, and there was a look in his eyes that she could not recognize. His bright, sapphire eyes bore into her topaz ones, seemingly growing darker the longer she held his gaze. She gulped. For some reason, she felt like a helpless mouse and he, a hungry wolf. His look was almost predatory, and subsequently she dropped her eyes, almost regretting it immediately, when she took in his full, muscular, broad chest and square shoulders. Apparently she had no control over her body anymore, for her eyes continued to slip down his wet, slightly hairy torso into his abdomen, the heavily defined muscles still clearly visible under the fine black hair. She suddenly felt weak at the knees and surprisingly lightheaded when her gaze dropped to his lilac crest. What? Her throat went completely dry and her face went red as a tomato when she realized what could lurk beneath the surface of the fountain waters. And although not entirely knowing what exactly, she knew it was personal. She flushed. She apparently raised her eyes to meet him again, but found his gaze wandering up and down her figure also. Suddenly feeling excruciatingly self-conscious, she cleared her throat loudly. His gaze instantly lifted, and he gave her a small smile and a slight incline of his head before turning away. Amara was completely flustered, and she turned briskly on her heel and more or less marched back to her spring, feeling as though she was 1,000,000 degrees, but also pleasantly lightheaded. As soon as she believed the well to be well out of sight, she let her face crack into a toothy grin and giggled. Why had he inclined his head like that? Was he just greeting her, or was he signaling some sort of approval? She couldn't seem to get the image out of her head, standing there so tall and strong and, oh Lord, soaking wet. Amara had grew hot at the thought, and something began to tingle in her belly. She didn't understand. She felt confused and slightly disoriented and raced back to the string, not even bothering to take off her robe before she threw herself into the water. Thorin, on the other hand, wasn't feeling quite so embarrassed. In fact, he was rather happy. The way the half-breed had just stood there like a deer about to be hunted highly amused him. But, on the other hand, he couldn't help but savor the way she looked. He couldn't seem to muster the strength to look away from her. She still had drops of water coating her skin, and something in his stomach groaned, and he saw a droplet from her neck roll beneath the wrap in her robe and into her cleavage. She didn't look as innocent as he most certainly did, but he didn't care. Her usually wild hair had been tamed, no longer half up in a messy bun, but falling down her back and out of her sight. It had been completely pushed out of the way of her face and made her look even smaller than she already was. He was rather surprised when he noticed she didn't have pointed ears, which he was a fair bit relieved about, and instead had small round ones. Her skin was its usual shimmering gold that, even now, never ceased to amaze him. Although her cheeks had flushed a bright fuchsia when she saw him, he found himself pleased by this. He had once again seen that strange bright turquoise sparkle along her collarbone, and he made a mental note to find out what it was. It was around the area a necklace would be, but shone too brightly to be any type of charm. As soon as he cleared his throat, he realized how rude he was being by staring at her, basking in her unorthodox beauty, and had given her a nod of approval and turned away again. He still didn't know what he felt about the strange water-dweller, but by the way his heart fiercely palpitated on sight of her, he had an inkling he wasn't going to get out of her grasp alive. Upon thinking this, he remembered how Lord Elrond had instantly recognized what she was, even without the tale. He decided then and there to find out more about her from the elf, for educational reasons, of course. He had a right to know who exactly they'd been traveling with for the past week. He didn't like the idea of asking the elf for help, though, so he would wait to see if Lord Elrond brought her up on his own. Maybe Thorin could get him to elaborate without actually asking any direct questions. That way he could get what he needed and keep his pride intact. He also didn't like the idea of some elf knowing more about his mermaid than he did. That thought made him clench his fists. Amara was late for dinner. She completely lost track of time, as per the usual, and was once again brushing her hair. She was once again dry, much to her disappointment, and was wearing a gown one of the elves had kindly brought for her. She had already decided that she didn't share the dwarves' obvious hate for elves. She didn't see the reason to, as, technically, they'd never done anything to her. But she did approach with caution because of Keely's words. She was completely smitten with her dress, though, and was heavenly glad that it wasn't blue. Okay. Despite being a mermaid, she despised the color blue, unless it was pale like the ones on her upper chest. or the cobalt of Thurin's eyes. The dress was actually a soft pink and silky smooth to the touch, which was probably why she wasn't itching as badly as usual. Its sleeves were fitted until they reached the elbow, where there was a fine band of golden embroidery, and then they loosened and opened out. The bust was also fitted and the collar was squared, completely displaying the fine crystals in her skin into the world. She didn't know how she felt about this. Obviously, it wasn't normal. Just under the bust, there was another golden band of embroidery before the dress loosened and fell to the floor. Upon her feet were, in her mind, the best things in the world. They were fine slippers, but completely lined with a soft, very fluffy material, which made her feel as if she was walking on clouds. She had left her hair down, feeling it was a nice change, but the shells, beads, flakes of gold, and all the other bits and pieces were still neatly woven into the silky strands. Amara stood up, giving one last glance at her appearance before leaving for dinner. She couldn't help but wonder if Thorn would like what she was wearing, and blushed at the thought, having not seen any of the dwarves since the scene earlier that afternoon. How would they react? In reality, the rest of the company didn't give two kettles about what had happened that afternoon. Some of them didn't even realize Amara had stumbled across them. Of course, Thorn kept his story to himself. His nephews didn't see his in the half-breed's little moment. Though, if they ever found out what happened, he'd never live it down. Thorn waited impatiently at Lord Elrond's table for Amara's arrival, constantly looking towards the door. Had she even eaten? Balin, however, had noticed the raven-haired dwarf's fidgeting, and had given him a soft yet stern elbow in the ribs when the elf lord wasn't looking. Thorn was on the verge of asking where she was, being torn between pride and curiosity, when Bilbo spoke. "Where's Amara? I haven't seen her all day." Thorn silently thanked Mala at that moment for Bilbo's innocent curiosity. That was a weird noise, cat. Lord Elrond and Gandalf shared a knowing look, and Gandalf chuckled somewhat. Thorn frowned. "She is probably brushing her hair, dear Bilbo," Gandalf chortled. "She is a mermaid after all, and has no perception of time." Bilbo shot the wizard a questioning look. "How can you have no perception of time?" It was a well-known fact that hobbits, in particular Master Baggins, were extremely organized with everything, especially their time, and the thought of wasting it was unheard of. So, hearing about a creature that had no awareness of such a thing was completely outlandish to them, and a little daunting. "Time is not real for water folk, Master Baggins," Lord Elrond clarified. "They have no need for it." At this, Bilbo spluttered a little bit, and began to mumble words like nonsense and twaddle under his breath. Thorn was about to ask more when Lord Elrond looked up and passed him, obviously distracted by something. Thorn followed his gaze and found Amara standing over at the other table, quite happily chatting to Balfour and laughing. She was facing Thorn, although her eyes were cast downward towards the sitting dwarf, and upon laying his eyes on her, his breath hitched in his throat. Without thinking, he abruptly stood up. Suddenly, all the attention was on him, including the half-breed, who was watching him curiously, almost expecting him to do something. "Decided to join us, then, did you?" His voice was rougher than intended, and for a moment the golden female looked rather taken aback. He had a bad feeling she had probably been up to no good. "Apologies, I must have lost track of time." She blinked at him innocently, making Thorn instantly feel guilty. Slowly he sunk back into his seat and nodded at her. "Why don't you join us here, Amara? It would truly be an honor to be in the presence of a water spirit." Lord Elrond stood also, but in greeting and hospitality rather than stupidity. Amara looked rather unsure, and she glanced at Balfour, who simply made a gesture for her to go. So she did. On her way over, she stopped at Keeley and patted him on the head and whispered something to him, which Thorn only just caught. "Don't worry, Keeley. I'm sure you'll catch up soon enough." This caused the entire table to burst into a riot of booming laughter. Thorn wasn't paying attention, however, and couldn't take his eyes off her. In the dim light, she positively glistened, and that's when he noticed the gem on her upper chest, just under and along the collarbone. They were bright aquamarine crystals. He'd know them anywhere. They were one of the rarest gems in all of Middle-earth. Now he knew why. Slowly, Amara sat down across from Thorn, giving a small smile to him. Thorn didn't return it. He couldn't. He was fixated on her chest, and in some sort of stupor, if his mother was still there, she'd wring his neck at his behavior and disregard for her manners. "So tell me, Boachi, did you come to be in the waters of the secret pass?" The elf lord asked, once again tucking into his dinner. Amara blinked at him before glancing down into her lap. Apologies, my lord, I'm not entirely sure, as I have been there for as long as I can recall. She did make a move to start eating, and Thorn frowned. He could see how tiny she was, and all he wanted to do was feed her, to fill her out a bit. Lord Elrond pulled a rather somber expression. Well, you're more than welcome to stay here for as long as you wish, as long as it takes to find your kin. At this, Thorn accidentally stabbed the carrot too hard with his fork out of anger, and it went whizzing through the air, nearly missing Bilbo. Lord Elrond simply gave Thorn a questioning look before continuing, leaving Thorin to stew on his own. It hadn't occurred to him that this was the place Gandalf was referring to when he said a place where she'd be most welcome. Over his dead body would he leave his half-breed with elves. Thorin didn't even notice that the conversation had shifted from Amara, and he was too busy plotting and stabbing his food to involve himself any further. It wasn't until he saw a shadow opposite him move that he looked up and found Amara watching his hands as he ate. She was awkwardly holding her knife and fork, trying to mimic what he was doing with his. A small bit of tongue poked out of her mouth as she concentrated. Thorin raised his brow, suddenly amused at the female. Her small fingers were having trouble working out the positions to hold her cutlery. He watched as she sighed and put the silveries down and picked up a spoon. She inspected it closely, pulled the face at her reflection, then quickly slipped it up her sleeve. All without even realizing Thorin was watching, until he laughed, that is. Amara was slightly startled first, having never heard Thorin laugh quite like that. It was deep and rumbling, like waves hitting rocks in a storm. She grinned at him, enjoying watching him laugh. His laugh soon died down into a chuckle, and he looked at her. She suddenly blushed, realizing he'd obviously seen her steal a spoon. They shared another look, and Amara couldn't help but slip into a bright blue of his eyes. May it be so bold to ask why you have aquamarine crystals around your neck? Amara looked up, a little surprised to find Thorin walking along beside her. The company had left dinner that evening, and Amara had found herself trailing along behind at the back, fiddling with the rings on her fingers and caught up in her own thoughts. She blinked at him, slowly absorbing his question and mulling over. I've had them since I was little. Thorin nodded in response, expecting that to be all she knew, but then she suddenly grabbed his hand and pulled him down a nearby I can't talk. Nearby hallway. He stared at her as she began to pace up and down in front of him, running a hand through her hair and looking somewhat distressed. I did a bad thing, she whispered, stopping in front of him and looking around anxiously for any nosy dwarfs or elves. Thorin blinked at her and raised a heavy brow. What did you do? She looked at him hesitantly for a moment. Her beautifully sculpted brows furrowed as she nervously chewed on her plump lips. Thorin stared at her lips. Promise not to tell? Amara whispered, still looking troubled. I promise. He took her hand in his reassuringly, nearly scowling at how cold she was. I lied to Lord Elrond. At this, Thorin threw his head back and roared with laughter. He felt Amara snatch her hand back from his and hiss. He tried to control his amusement and looked down at her. The mermaid's eyes were dark, and she was scowling heavily at him, clearly irritated, with her usual glow gone and her crystals murky. My sincerest apologies. Thorin paused and reached out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. At the contact, her scowl disappeared and her face softened again. It was like someone had rebuilt a candle within her, for her eyes suddenly lit back up. Her skin began to glitter once more, and her crystals shone again. At the magical sight, Thorin forgot to breathe, and instinctively took a step towards her, his hand still lightly resting on the side of her head. He slowly slid it down her soft neck, over where her gills once were, but were now shimmering golden lines. At his touch, Amara purred, savoring the slight tickle as his rough fingers lightly grazed her closed gills. Without thinking, she leaned into his touch, momentarily shutting her eyes. Thorin couldn't stop staring as the creature before him glowed brighter and brighter, and without even thinking, which seemed to do a lot in her presence, he noticed. He opened his mouth and said quietly, Mademoiselle. Amara blinked at him, not understanding what he meant. Thorin took another step closer, their bodies now only inches apart. Amara watched him with wide eyes. Her stomach felt like it was doing somersaults, and she felt like she was about to faint. But she also didn't want this moment to end. She felt amazing and terrified all at once. But she knew she had to stay focused. Guilt was bubbling up inside of her, and she had to get the truth off her chest. You're beautiful, Thorin murmured. He leaned forward, placing his lips teasingly close to hers as he tested the waters. Both his hands were now gently covering her cold cheeks, his thumb gently caressing the glistening skin. He knew he was being bold, and he began to wonder if he'd underestimated the strength of elven wine. But he was violently pulled from his thoughts by Amara grinning at him, reaching up, and playfully tapping him on the head with her first finger. "Focus, Thorin, I'm disabled." Thorin instantly dropped his hand and briskly backed away, clearing his throat awkwardly as he did so. "Yes, what?" he grunted at her, feeling somewhat annoyed that she had killed his mood. He wasn't used to being rejected with anything, so he imagined when it came to women, they too would never reject him. His stomach suddenly felt like it was made of lead. He felt like he'd lost something, and losing was the only thing he hated more than else. Only just behind Smog, of course. "I said I lied to Lord Elrond," she hissed softly, glancing round quickly again. "About what?" Thorin had felt like someone had dipped a bucket of cold water over him, and then thrown the bucket and have it hit him square in the face. Amara awkwardly shuffled down her feet, and Thorin grew impatient quickly. "Well," he almost snapped. Admittedly, he was suddenly grumpy and embarrassed about being rejected by her. She was a half-breed. Why would she reject a king? His ego and pride had been totally squashed. Amara stopped shuffling and dropped her hands from knotting into her dress. Her glow had blown out again, and her eyes were dark once more. "Forget it," she hissed. "I thought I could confide in you, but clearly I'm wrong." Her words were laced with venom, and her eyes grew darker still. "What is wrong with you?" "Excuse me?" he barked, heavily offended, taking another step forward to glower over her. She stood her ground. "How dare you, half-breed?" "How dare I what? Not be cowed by your impossible temperaments? Don't tell me I'm beautiful, then act like you don't care." With that, she turned on her heel and stomped away. Thorin groaned, realizing how he must have come across as a pig. "Amara, wait." Amara turned back to him. "Don't you dare ever call me a half-breed again. Ashush," she hissed, and in the dim light, Thorin could see how black her eyes were, filled with fury, and her usually closed gills flared angrily. He made to go after her, his heavy boots echoing as he jogged around the corner she had turned. He groaned again when she was already gone. I have chocolate. Yummy, yummy chocolate. Chapter 8, Fihun. Thorin spent the majority of the following day trying to find the mermaid. He had woken to a feeling of complete horror when he realized how his action the previous night must have betrayed him. He partly blamed it on her heritage to lure in his intake of little too much wine. But he couldn't help but feel the familiar nauseating feeling build up in his stomach. The feeling that was telling him that it was not necessarily the case. He wanted to apologize. He knew he was in the wrong, and he wanted to tell her he did not know what possessed him to be so forward. But he couldn't find the female anywhere. The dwarf wandered the elven halls almost sulkily, searching for Amara, but to no avail. The afternoon was growing cold, and he knew he was supposed to be meeting with Lord Elrond after supper to discuss the map. His stomach rumbled at the thought of food, and he inwardly signed, changing his directions to their dining hall. He wasn't surprised to find the rest of the company had conjugated theirs already, taking their anticipation and enthusiasm to be fed. Although, upon seeing no sight of the mermaid, he turned on the hobbit. Bilbo had become rather close to Amara after the past few days, and he assumed without doubt that Bilbo had at least seen her today. On Thorin's approach, Bilbo stiffened, feeling a little uneasy. The Dwarf King saw Bilbo's anxiety and clenched his fists involuntarily. He must have known what happened. "Bilbo, a word?" Bilbo twitched awkwardly, looking unsure but nodded anyway, stepping away from Balfour and following Thorin back out of the dining hall. There was a moment of silence while Thorin chose his words carefully. He didn't want to come across as aggressive to the halfling, for no doubt this information would then be passed on to Amara, and he didn't want to appear any more of a swine. To Thorin's surprise, it was Bilbo who spoke first in the end. "I assume you're wondering where Amara is? She told me what happened." Bilbo rang his hands together uncomfortably, and Thorin sighed, his rage beginning to swell in his stomach. "I guessed as much," he responded stiffly, "and I assume that is why she's not here." Bilbo looked up then, his eyes wide and his face confused. "What? Oh no, she's just busy." "Doing what?" Thorin asked possessively, although it wasn't really a question, more of a command. Bilbo began fidgeting again. "I can't say." "Why not?" Thorin was leaning over the hobbit now, his temper ticking away. "She didn't tell me." Thorin knew the halfling was lying, but he was about to argue but then stopped himself. He held his tongue and swallowed his words. Very well. Well, if you see her, you can tell her I wish to speak with her. Bilbo nodded quickly, a little surprised at these words, as these words weren't the words he was expecting to As these weren't the words he was expecting. Thorin turned to leave, but then added lowly, and extend to her my sincerest apologies. Bilbo's face looked troubled. Of course, he answered briskly before following Thorin back into the dining room. It was late into the evening before Amara joined the rest of the company. She had found the Miner's Stone overlook, turning elven furniture into ash and cooking meat. The mermaid took a seat next to Balfour, frowning slightly. Where have you been, lass? Balfour asked her, his usual cheeky smile appearing from under his mustache. And why so glum? Amara pursed her lips as she eyed up the fire before her. Should you be burning the elves' furniture and cooking food they don't eat? Isn't it a little disrespectful? Balfour made a pff noise and waved her queerly away like it was a pesky fly. Morals. Amara laughed at him. That's not fair. Life's not fair. Here, Bomber, catch! Balfour plucked the sausage he was cooking off his skewer and threw it to his ginger brother, who quickly caught it. No sooner than he did, however, the table beneath him creaked and groaned, and before he knew it, the wood under him collapsed. The entire company erupted into roaring laughter, including Amara, who laughed even harder at the sight of Balfour roaring around like a beetle on its back, unable to get up. Amara stood and made her way over to the door, giving the fire a wide berth as she did. She stuck out her hand to him, and with much difficulty pulled him up into a seated position. It wasn't until she went to sit beside Bilbo that she noticed his absence, along with Thorin's, Balin's, and Gandalf's. Although the lack of presence from the latter wasn't unusual, she hadn't seen him since supper the night before, and from what Bilbo had told her, it was pretty standard for the wizard to wander off. Where's Bilbo? Amara asked, taking a seat between her and Balfour and Bomber. Balfour and Balfour. Right? No. Bifur and Balfour. His names. He's gone with Thorin, Balin, and Gandalf to speak with Lord Eladon about the map. Balfour answered without thinking. He was too busy skewing another sausage. What map? Amara inquired, brows furrowed. Balfour paused, suddenly realizing what he'd said. He shared a worried look with his brother before clearing his throat. Nothing. Tell me, Amara urged, feeling out of the loop. Just tell the lass, came Nori's voice from the other side of the outlook, sitting beside his brother. She'll find out sooner or later anyways. We shouldn't tell her without Thorin's permission, Feely interjected pointedly. The dwarves continued to discuss this further, and a small argument broke out. And Amara could see it over nothing. Her head flew from side to side as she tried to follow what was being said. Then suddenly, it all went silent. Everyone's eyes now on the door, and on Thorin, who just entered. In a few strides, Thorin made his way to the balcony, completely ignoring the rest of the company. Bilbo and Balin shuffled in soon after, Bilbo instantly coming to sit by Amara. What happened? The golden-haired female muttered to the halfling, not taking her eyes off of Thorin as he rested his arms on the balcony, looking grimly into the distance. Rage and unease seemed to radiate off him. Something pulled on her heartstrings at the sight, and she was stubborn and still hurt from the way he'd spoken to her the night before. She felt a little betrayed. She thought she could trust him. Bilbo fidgeted out of words, oddly trying not to relay any inappropriate information to the outsider. I know there's a map involved, although I know not what it entails. She shot Feely a playful glare, who just hooted in laughter in return. Bilbo eased a bit at this. You cannot read it yet. The moon is not right. It is only a few weeks before it is, but it means we'll be staying here for a while. Bilbo stifled a grin at this, but then nodded over towards Thorin, although Thorin's not so happy about that. Why not? We're trying to get somewhere, and stay here for longer than necessary is wasting time. He added fingers quotes when appropriate. He then leaned in closer. Plus, he's too mulish to take any sort of hospitality from the elves. Amara nodded understanding at his last comment. But what's the rush? The mer blinked at the hobbit. Because we must reach the Lonely Mountain before others do. Amara's head snapped towards Thorin, who still stood overlooking the valley. Balin now at his side, a concerned look upon his face. The Lonely Mountain? What's that? And why would others go there? The mountain is our dwarven homeland. Within its stone lays a dragon. Amara's eyes widened, remembering what Keely had told her about Erebor. We know not if he is alive or dead, but for all we know, the treasure within the mountains lay unprotected, vulnerable for others to claim. We must take back our home. Everyone was silent, somewhat surprised that the oh-so-secretive Thorin Oakenshield was revealing their secret so plainly. So what are you going to do? We are going to reclaim our homeland and slay that dragon. Bilbo suddenly jumped when Amara abruptly scrambled to her feet. The hobbit blinked up at his friend, his fists clenched and her fists clenched and gills flaring uncharacteristically. Thorn was now watching her, her brow furrowed with concentration. He took his hands off the balcony and straightened up. You plan to slay at Durgar? She hissed, the jewels on her chest burning a bright cobalt blue. What gives you the right to? I have the only right to take back what that worm stole from me. The lives of many people it took, Thorn warned, instinctively back, advancing towards her. The company looked between the two helplessly. However, Amara didn't know what to say back to that, and she looked completely torn. Between what, though, no one knew. Instead, she turned on her heels and stomped away. Billy quickly jumped up and chased after the mermaid, calling for her as he went. What was that about? Keeley asked from his position on the sofa next to his brother. Mermaids, Thorn hissed under his breath, turning back to the balcony edge. No, Balin corrected, patting his king on the back. Woman. It had been a few days since the incident on the Overlook, and Thorn had seen no sign of Amara, but apparently the others had. He almost felt hurt when he overheard Keeley telling Dolan about how he had tried out Amara's bow. He had been pleasantly surprised to discover the female had indeed been true to her word, for he had never seen an arrow fly so fast. Dolan had replied with agreement, telling Keeley about how light Amara's sword was to spar with, and how the spikes on the knuckle guard were perfect to inflict a nasty backhand. Thorn almost felt left out. It was like the mermaid was purposely ignoring him, which she undoubtedly was. But this was just rubbing in his face. It annoyed him how the rest of the company got on with her so well, but he couldn't. His pride had engulfed him, and he was too stubborn to go and apologize to her now, especially after she'd taken the side of a dragon. Smaug had destroyed his home, his family, his friends, his people, and now his mermaid was on its side. He was the one who felt betrayed now, let down almost. The creature had caused him so much pain and grief, and Amara supported that? Amara defended that? This angered Thorn. How could she defend such a beast? Thorn was wandering around the elven halls, so lost in thought and trying to extinguish the burning anger inside of him, that he almost missed Bilbo looking up at a painting. He went to stand beside the halfling, looking up at the painting too, although he did not like it. He cleared his throat to gain Bilbo's attention, who jumped and span to face him. Oh, hello, Thorn. His brow then furrowed with confusion. What are you doing here? He couldn't understand why a dwarf would have any interest in elven art. I wish to have a ward, Thorn spoke lowly. Bilbo dropped his gaze. Oh? Why did He quickly stopped himself, clearing his throat. He started again. Why did Amara storm off the other night? He was trying to keep his anger on tight reins. Bilbo turned away. She did. Thorn rolled his eyes. Then and there he swallowed his pride. He lowered his voice to no more than a whisper. I have grown fond of her, but I keep upsetting her. I wish for me and her to be on better terms. Bilbo stared at Thorn in bewilderment. What? He almost laughed. Thorn raised an eyebrow, and Bilbo quickly composed himself. You just have a funny way of showing it. Maybe if she didn't respect our people by siding with a dragon, then I may be able to show it better. Bilbo huffed. She didn't mean to. He quickly cut himself off and set his lips. What? How could she not mean to? Bilbo just shook his head, as if sworn to secretly. I don't know if it's my place to say. I would ask her myself, but I can never find her, and when I do, all I seem to do is offend her. So maybe you will be doing her a favor by keeping me out of her hair. He couldn't help but let the last feuds roll bitterly off his tongue. Bilbo sighed and ushered him to come sit on a nearby bench. Thorn waited patiently for the hobbit to begin, and when he did, the dwarf prompted him. Well, why is she a traitor? She's not! Bilbo almost snapped. Thorn's eyebrows rose. Bilbo quickly mumbled an apology before sighing. Mermaids worship a creature called a Finhoon. The hobbit stumbled over the pronunciation, which is sort of like a sea dragon. She said a thin worm, but it's like they're essentially the same thing. But it's a result all dragons are sacred, and even the fire breathers. Thorn mulled this over. Does that explain her discomfort? Sort of, he mumbled. Pray tell. Bilbo fidgeted. Well, of course, that's part of it. She hates fire, so a dragon as we knew it is her worst nightmare. A Finhoon is a water creature and has no association with fire. But she also cares about all of us, so hearing about you and your kin's ill-fated past upset her. Thorn understood, and he was so very relieved. She wasn't a traitor. She didn't betray him. She just didn't want to side with Smaug. She had an obligation to her race and her culture. She sided with a water dragon, which happened to be kin to Smaug. She had sided with the beast through default and not through choice. She was shocked at first that you dared to challenge a creature that was so precious to her people. But then she remembered its wrath and reign and wavered. She cares about us, Thorn. All of us, including you. Thorn remained silent for some time, mulling over the halfling's words, until he finally spoke, something clicking in his head. But I thought she knew not of her kin, of her culture, or her past. She told Lord Elrond that the caves were all she knew. Bilbo's sudden twitching spoke louder than words. That is what she lied about? Bilbo's silence confirmed his musing. But why? Mermaids are secretive. Have you not noticed that she has never stopped talking? But yet you and your kin do not know a single thing about her. Thorin paused. He was thinking hard. Does she not trust us? He paused. Me? He almost felt guilty. She had also told us to be private. She's also told to be privately that she knew nothing of her kin. He expected. He expected himself to be angry that he had been so openly lied to, but he wasn't. If anything, he felt remorseful and almost embarrassed that he came across as so unapproachable in her eyes, and slightly resentful that the halfling seemed to get along with her so well. I know she told Bolfor a few things, and she did try to tell you. Bilbo shot Thorn a surprisingly hard glance. I do not know why exactly she is so secretive. Maybe it's the reason you dwarves are. Because it's nobody else's business outside of our kin, Thorn responded gruffly. Bilbo shrugged. Maybe she feels the same. I don't think she wants to burden people. She's not a burden, Thorn mumbled, more to himself than Bilbo. You said she was, Bilbo reminded him. Thorn sighed. What else do you know? Like what? Tastes, preferences, I don't know. Anything I can avoid insulting her in the future with. Bilbo thought for a moment. She's partial to anything sweet, he retorted before blinking at the Dwarven King. That's it? She likes flowers. Bilbo fidgeted some more. To be honest, she doesn't talk much about herself. She doesn't stop talking, Thorin nearly snorted. But if you haven't noticed, she doesn't talk about herself. This is what I mean. She's very secretive, very reserved. Thorin scuffed again. He didn't believe the hobbit and was convinced he was lying to him once more. Bilbo pursed his lips. Fine. What's her favorite color? Thorin blinked at the hobbit, slightly startled by his sudden question. You said she didn't stop talking. She must have mentioned her favorite color, or smell, her last name. Truthfully, Thorin didn't know the answer to any of these questions, but thinking on his feet, he retorted to Heidi blue. Wrong. She hates blue. Her favorite color is pink. Why does she trust you so much? Because I'm her friend. She has a lot to offer. If you help her, even if it's only something minor, in return she will help you greatly. Like she did with your nephews. So I behave. What? Thorin wasn't aware she'd done anything to Keely and Phoebe, and for a split second he was rather alarmed. She blessed them. At least I think that's what she did. Bilbo had a thoughtful look on his face. Last night in the moonlight, I noticed something glistening gold on their temples. Curious, I asked Lord Elrond, and he told me Amara must have blessed them. And I assumed she did it when they saved her life. And what exactly does a mermaid blessing entail? Thorin was slightly concerned. He didn't feel comfortable with Amara's ways yet, and he wasn't sure if he was willing to let his heirs be dragged into it. Balfour was right. Mermaids can be cruel, aloof, and unreliable. But teach her well, and she can learn. Treat her right, and she could well save your life. Bilbo gave Thorin a pointed look before continuing. From what I gathered from Lord Elrond, a mermaid's kiss is a token. Rather than a brushing of luck or something unsentimental like that, it is a promise that she will always look after them, no matter what. Thorin actually smiled. Something swelled in his chest, and a slight tug on his heartstrings began for the strange water dweller. Lord Elrond knows more about the creatures. Bilbo nodded. From what I could tell, he finds them fascinating. Thorin stood and nodded towards Bilbo in appreciation and abruptly departed. Nom 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 nom. Chocolate. Okay, Chapter 9. Crushes and Harpsichord. Amara was basking once again, like she had been doing nearly every day since being in Rivendell. She seemed to be managing her time well, for once, thanks to the help from Bilbo. for she would spend the morning basking in the warm waters and sunshine. Then she'd go to find Feely and Keely and listen to their stories. She'd then find Balin and have him read to her. This was followed usually by being told jokes by Buffer and Biffer. She'd then go find Bomber and have some food. That was followed by meeting up with Ori, Dory, and Nori to learn about the dwarven culture, as they so proudly spoke of it. She'd then go spar with Dalwyn, which was her least favorite thing to do. Not because she didn't like said dwarf, but because she was in fact a very skilled swordsman in the water. But out of the water, not so much. Her feet would always get tangled, and she'd end up hurting herself without fail. Which is why she'd go see Owen and Glowin next. She'd then go meet back up with Bumper and for food before going to meet Lindar while everyone else ate. After they'd eaten, Amara would go find Bilbo and spend the remaining daylight with him, and usually well into the night. She was, however, avoiding Thorin. She told herself it was because he had malicious intentions towards the dragon, but deep down she knew this wasn't the case. The dragon they wanted to destroy was a fire breather, and therefore not a favorite of the mermaids. So in reality, she didn't care. She was mainly ignoring him because, in fact, his presence she felt funny. She couldn't stay mad at him, even though he was totally disrespectful towards her a few nights ago. Every spare moment she had, she found her thoughts would trail back to him, and this annoyed her. She didn't know why they did, and she didn't want them to. What's wrong? The mermaid was snapped from her thoughts by a little poke from Bilbo. She blinked at him. I asked what's wrong, he repeated, fishing off his daisy chain and handing it to her. Instantly, she put it on her head. She still had the flowers Buffer had weaved into her hair, which was now well over 2 weeks ago, even though she hadn't taken them out. She'd taken them out a few times since then, but they still hadn't died or even been close to wilting. Not that she was surprised. She knew they wouldn't wilt while she kept them. Nothing, she lied, toying with her own daisy chain. Nothing at all. Bilbo made a noise and peered at her, scrutinizing her. Before he knew it, she wasn't going to talk. Then she never would. He didn't want to push her and upset her, so he'd just have to wait for the time to come. Although the hobbit was surprisingly shrewd, although he never showed it, and he had an inkling he knew what her troubles were about. Thorin asked about you the other day. Bingo. Amara's sulking head snapped up to meet him, an eager but cautious look in her eyes. He did? Really? She asked him, maybe a little too quickly. Bilbo smiled triumphantly. Yes, he wants to make things up with you, you know. He doesn't mean to upset you. Amara's brow furrowed and she bit her lip nervously, her usually large eyes growing even wider as she thought. She then recoiled into herself and Bilbo frowned. What's wrong? My stomach feels weird, Amara frowned. How so? I think I have parasites. I keep getting this strange feeling. It feels like there's loads of little creatures crawling around in my belly, but it doesn't feel wholly unpleasant. Her face changed from complete disgust to a confused one. She blinked at Bilbo, who was now smiling broadly. Does it feel like you have a million tiny butterflies fluttering around inside you? Yes, exactly. Have you had it too? What's wrong with me? Bilbo hooted with laughter. My dear, I think you have a crush. Thorin was pacing up and down the elven halls, waiting for Lord Elrond. He arranged to meet him after supper, and was now doing just that. Thorin had been early, though, although he would deny himself that it was anticipation or eagerness. He just wanted some straight answers about their saltwater companion. He wanted to know who and what she was exactly. Good evening, Master Dwarf. Lord Elrond's smooth voice floated from behind Thorin, and he stopped and turned to face him. Thorin inclined his head respectfully. Lord Elrond, he greeted. Shall we? Lord Elrond motioned for them to walk. So Thorin did, and for a short while they walked in silence. Thorin was trying to choose his words carefully, but in the end, he hadn't even bothered. I think I know why you wanted to see me. The elf peered down at Thorin knowingly. Oh? Thorin's voice was deep and stiff. You have a right to know who she is, Thorin Oakenshield. Thorin just nodded stiffly and waited for the Lord to continue. I may not be able to give you all the answers you desire, but I'm sure I can help. You do not know much of mermaids? Thorin asked, feeling a cross between disappointment and smugness. I know everything they've ever shared, Master Dwarf, but unfortunately, it's not a lot. The water folk are more secretive than even you dwarves. I see. Well, what do you know, then? There was a brief pause where the elf lord thought carefully about his words. Mermaids not the same as you and I. He began, and instantly he made Thorin frown. He didn't like the suggestion that elves and dwarves were the same, but nevertheless he held his tongue and nodded respectfully at the end as a sign for him to continue. They see us land dwellers as not truly alive. Mermaids are sentimental creatures, and we do not feel how they do. We cannot see the world as they see it. When we look at another person, we see a nose, a pair of eyes, and a mouth, whereas they feel the person, from their hopes and dreams to their current mood, from their history to their future. They feel things rather than just see the surface. They are an entirely different spiritual level to us. This happens to make a lot of sense to Thorin. He had noticed that Amara seemed to have a connection to things that, to him, were so trivial and meaningless. It also explained why she gravitated towards the more easygoing members of the company, and why she therefore strayed from him. More folk may have deep connections so complicated that we can never understand, but they are not high in intelligence. Their language is very basic and contains limited words. They mostly use sounds to communicate. Again, this explained a lot to Thorn. Amara was always making strange sounds, a noise for every feeling, so it seemed. Although he managed to decipher most of them, there were still a few that he couldn't understand. Their deep connection to all living things and their strength and downfall. Physically, they are very strong and hard to hurt, and nearly impossible to kill. But once they are emotionally hurt, they are catastrophically weakened. Something as painful as a family member dying is enough to make any of the next kin terminal. Even small amounts of emotional turmoil is fatal to them. There was a long pause while Thorin let Elrond's words sink in. It was strange. The mermaid was a delicate mixture of vulnerable and powerful. Amara once said to me that she is not afraid of death because it will take her home. What does that mean? Thorin asked. He was rather reluctant to share such a personal conversation between him and his mermaid, especially to the likes of an elf. But he wanted answers. Lord Elrond was silent for a moment, and when he finally spoke, his words were slow. Mermaids see death as coming home. To them, mortality is just a bridge in which they have to cross to become their true states. Living is just a physical consciousness, and when they die, they return to the water and become the foam that sits upon it. And this doesn't scare them? Death? Would you be afraid of going home? Merfolk are children of the sea. They are bound to the water in ways we couldn't imagine, and nothing can change that. They are bound to the waters, and they will always return to it. Lord Elrond's words didn't sit right with Thorin. The dwarf turned to him. I thank you for your information. I must return to the rest of my company. I bid you good night, he said rather coldly, not wanting to linger in the likes of an elf for more than necessary. He turned to leave, but a light hand on his shoulder stopped him. I must warn you, Master Oakenshield, that a mermaid cannot be tamed. They, by nature, are decisive creatures. They may be empathetic, but they are also detached. They have no reason to bond with others, that they know we landfolk cannot live like they do. And therefore, they do not bother. For some reason, his last words made his chest feel as if it was filled with rocks. Lord Elrond knew what plagued the dwarf's mind, and he knew why. So he took it upon himself to pay him a warning. What he didn't take into consideration, however, is that Amara did not know landfolk couldn't love like she, and that she also did not know what love was. Thorin left Lord Elrond then, giving him his thanks and taking off in the other direction with heavy footsteps and a brooding temper. Amara could not sleep. She kept tossing and turning and was able to get comfortable. She was restless. Her mind would not relax. With a heavy sigh, she sat up and made a noise of exasperation. She swung her legs over to the side of the bed and brushed the hair out of her eyes. Her meeting with Lindor hadn't gone as planned. She was unable to concentrate on her lessons, and her mind was over. But, like most elves, Lindar had the patience of a saint, and instead of trying to force her to do something she was never going to do in her current detached and somewhat troubled state, he instead went about braiding the girl's hair, as it was as disabled as her thoughts. So it was no longer its wild mass of golden curls, but instead braided away from her face to fall into a single fishtail plait down her back and over her shoulder. The flowers and ornaments still intertwined, sparkling in the starlight. Gingerly, the mermaid stood and walked over to a robe that swung over her vanity chair. She loosely slipped it on and ventured outside. She was debating going for a quick dip when something whimsical floated through the air and into her ears. She looked around herself. Her eyes wide, glowing at the beautiful sound. She turned back around, her back now to the water, and instead of answering the water's call for her, she walked away, following the sweet music. She climbed up a narrow flight of steps, across another balcony, and entered one of the hills of Rivendell. She continued to follow the music, her bare feet leaving little hops on the marble floor as she went. She was almost swaying along to the tune. It was so sweet and delicate. She never heard anything like it. It was like raindrops hitting the water, but better. Her path turned and twisted as she continued along. She didn't stop for a good long while, until the hallway opened up into a lounging room. And there, situated upon one of the stools, was Thorin Oakenshield, and there, propped against his shoulder, was a large golden instrument. Amara didn't recognize the artifact, though, and she was about to leave again. She had noticed the intense look on Thorin's face, and she couldn't help but think this was a rather private moment. But Thorin stopped playing and looked up at her as she hovered in the doorway. Something in the young mermaid's chest went thud when she saw the look on his face. For a split second, the dwarf looked vulnerable. His eyes were dark and filled with sadness and hurt. But he blinked, and his hard exterior returned. "Can I help you?" His deep, baritone voice rumbled through the halls, echoing somewhat in the silence. Amara stood at her feet, shuffling silently. "Sorry, I didn't mean to oppose." "You didn't," Thorin answered quickly, and Amara looked up, finally meeting his eyes. For a moment they were silent, but then Thorin remembered. "I'm truly sorry about the other night. I do not know what in the name of Durin came over me." He glanced away in shame. "I would have apologized sooner, but I was unable to find you." He looked back at her to find her gaze lingering on the harp, still propped on his shoulder. "Are you able to forgive me?" There was a long moment before she finally spoke, and when she did, it wasn't what Thorin had expected. "What's that?" she asked, taking a hesitant step towards the dwarf. Thorin blinked at her for a moment before straightening up. It is a harpsichord." "Is that what was making that wonderful sound?" The girl's eyes left the instrument and went to linger on Thorin. She took another step and into a flood of moonlight. Instantly, her entire being began to glisten again. Thorin didn't reply for a moment. He was too busy taking her in. She truly was a magnificent creature. They'd been in Rivendell a little over 2 weeks, and she'd already started to show some environmental changes. She had been spending most of her time outside, and had subsequently developed a slight browning of her skin, and it shimmered more of a brassy gold than a white gold. She also, according to Bombra and Bilbo, had an extremely sweet tooth, one that would give Keeley a run for his money, and she was especially fond of cakes and pastries, apparently eating a great deal of them and filling a good portion of her diet with them. Thanks to this, she'd felled out a little, for when Thorin met her she was almost scrawny if it wasn't for her slight athletic build due to her swimming. But now she had a small layer of meat on her, and she looked so much healthier for it. "Yes, I was playing it," he finally replied, his eyes not leaving hers. "Playing it?" Like Bolfer plays his... She trailed off, wiggling her fingers in front of her face to resemble a clarinet. A smile flashed on Thorin's face. He still didn't accept how her presence would lighten his mood. Just being near her calmed him, and even though his previous thoughts were grave, he now felt happy. "Yes," he replied, although the small smile lingered. He couldn't help but feel uneasy at the fact she'd avoided to accept his apology. "Can you teach me?" Thorin's eyebrows actually rose a notch at her question, and he found himself surprised that she was asking for his help, especially with something that would consequently lead to them spending time together. "I can," he nodded, and in one swift moment the female closed the distance between them and sat beside the dwarf, pressed right up against him. Thorin stiffed a bit, trying to ignore the fact she was so close and smelled so sweet. Okay, so that was the 3 chapters that apparently did not get posted and missing from the playlist. So yeah, sorry if you guys went through the whole playlist and it wasn't there. So these are the few chapters that actually were missing. Alrighty, peace out, knights.